Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started. Imagine this. There is a secret room with television screens hidden away from the entire world. Inside this room is a group of soldiers with a license to kill. They're watching your streets through cameras and they can bomb anything and anyone just on the basis of suspicion. Would you allow such a secret death squad to exist? I'm sure you wouldn't. No one would. But the people of Syria were not given a choice. This death squad is not imaginary. It existed during the war against ISIS. The Americans ran the secret strike cell for 5 years. They dropped more than 100,000 bombs. They killed innocent civilians. What's more shocking is that they try to hide all of these crimes. So tonight we want to ask a question. Who is going to hold America to account for all of this? A secret cell repeatedly kills civilians without proof, just on the basis of suspicion. This fits the description of a war crime. So tonight we ask, who gave the US the license to wage wars on civilians? And who will investigate America's many war crimes? That's what we'll discuss. Also on the show tonight, a two-front threat is brewing for the West. China and Russia are shaping a military alliance. We'll tell you what's cooking. Chinese 5G gear on American weapons. The UAE is facing a difficult choice. Abu Dhabi has threatened to cancel a $23 billion order of F-35 jets. Is this a real threat or a negotiating tactic? We'll discuss that. Are Bitcoins worthless? The Bank of England is warning that Bitcoin investors should be prepared to lose all their investments. And this is a story that you don't want to miss. In Brazil, 2 lawmakers decided to settle a dispute through an MMA fight. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
Group Captain Varun Singh died today from injuries sustained in the chopper crash, which killed India's top general and 12 others on December 8th, said the Indian Air Force in a statement. Group Captain Singh was the sole survivor and was on life support for nearly a week. More than 1,200 people have been rescued from Hong Kong's World Trade Center as firefighters managed to tame a fire that erupted in one of the city's busiest buildings. and left more than a dozen people injured. This was after more than 300 people were trapped on the rooftop of the building. Lithuania's diplomatic delegation to China leaves the country in a hasty exit, say diplomatic sources. This as relations soured further over Taiwan, which opened a de facto embassy in the capital Vilnius last month. The U.S. House of Representatives has voted to recommend former President Trump's White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, be held in contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate in a probe into the January 6th Capitol riots. The Indian government approves a $10 billion incentive plan to push the manufacturing of semiconductors in the country. The government has set a target to have at least 20 semiconductor units across the country in the next 2 years. South Africa's High Court has declared the medical parole for Jacob Zuma unlawful and ordered the former president to return to jail to serve his 15-month prison sentence. The United States has crossed 800,000 COVID-19 deaths, with more than half the deaths reported this year itself. A vast majority of fatalities were among the unvaccinated. British annual inflation skyrocketed in November to 5.1%, the highest level in more than 10 years. Argentine striker Sergio Aguero has announced his premature retirement from football at the age of 33 due to a heart condition. In an emotional press conference at his current club Barcelona, Aguero said he was following medical advice after collapsing during a Spanish league match on October 30th and subsequently being hospitalized. He ends a glittering career with 427 goals, 260 of them for Manchester City, whom he led to 14 major trophies including 5 league titles. Golden State Warriors guard Stephen Curry has broken the all-time record for the most three-pointers scored by a single player in the NBA. Curry passed the previous mark of 2,973 long-range shots in the first quarter of a 105-96 win against the New York Knicks. Hall of Fame Ray Allen, who held the previous record, presented Curry with a commemorative jersey to mark the achievement.
Let me start with some questions tonight. What was America's war on terror really about? Was it about gunning down terrorists? Or was it about killing civilians and bombing nations to control them? I'm sure you know the answer. I'm sure you've seen many headlines and exposés this year. Tonight we come to you with more proof. The United States is no guardian of human rights. It is guilty of war crimes. Let me show you some headlines from this year. The US drone strike in Kabul was a quote-unquote mistake. An American bomb killed 7 children. The US blamed it on faulty intel. Here's another one. US military concealed Syria airstrike that killed dozens of civilians. It led to one of the largest civilian death tolls in the war. But there was no punishment for the US. And this has become a trend. The United States of America bombs countries at will and gets away with it. That's because nobody is holding them accountable. Neither international agencies nor international media, and certainly not our leaders. So tonight we want to tell you about an American war crime, yet another American war crime. This one is from Syria. What did the US do? They ran a death squad, a secret mission. They ran it for 5 years. This group, the death squad, pounded Syria with more than 100,000 bombs and missiles. 100,000. They killed innocent civilians. How do we know about this? A recent report has exposed this secret strike cell. This group was called Talon Anvil. What is Talon Anvil? That's code name. Secret American military unit. It operated from 2014 to 2019 for 5 whole years. This unit was led by members of the Delta Special Forces. Delta is the Special Operations Force of the US Army. They're elite soldiers. They're said to be the best of the best. So what were they doing with Talon Anvil? They were bombing Syria at will. They bombed whatever they thought was a target. This group was first stationed in Iraq. Then they were moved to northern Syria. The team had less than 20 officers. They worked round the clock and in 3 shifts. This was basically a 24/7 operation. Talon Anvil monitored what was happening on the battlefield. They had giant television screens. That's what they used to monitor action on the battlefield. And whenever they spotted something they thought was suspicious, they ordered a strike. Just like that. No background checks, no effort to verify any tip-offs. You see movement you don't like and you strike. That's how they operated for 5 years. How many bombs and missiles did they drop? 112,000. That's one estimate. 112,000 bombs in 5 years. Who were they hitting? These officers thought they were neutralizing terrorist convoys, car bombs, command centers, enemy fighters. But on the ground, these bombs were killing civilians, farmers, children on the street, families fleeing the war, villagers taking shelter inside buildings. They were all hit. And this went on for 5 years. Let me repeat that. Talon Anvil was killing civilians for 5 years. Did nobody notice? Did nobody object? The answers are yes and yes. Their actions were noticed and there was some protest. Some American pilots flying over Syria opposed Talon Anvil. On some occasions, they refused to drop bombs. Why? Because they were asked to hit quote-unquote questionable targets in densely populated areas. Officers from the CIA also complained. They were worried about what they called a disturbing pattern of strikes. Even within Talon Anvil, some members refused to participate in these airstrikes. But such interventions were few and far between. Also, they were ineffective. Many of these complaints went to top military leaders. What did they do? Reports say they chose to look the other way. For most part, Talon Anvil did what they thought best because the system allowed it. And Talon Anvil did not just exist on paper. It had a top secret status. Almost every operation it undertook was highly classified. So there was no scope of external oversight or monitoring. The unit itself took steps to hide its misdeeds. Reports say they prevented the collection of evidence. They turned away drone cameras during key moments of strike missions. So basically, they did not allow their actions to be documented. And when there is no evidence, you can imagine how any investigation into this would pan out. Many officers, in fact, believed that civilian deaths were unavoidable. Allow me to quote what one officer told a newspaper off the record. This officer said he saw so many civilian deaths, he eventually came to accept them as part of the job. Who gave the United States this job? To kill civilians in far-off lands and then justify it. And who will hold the US to account for this? The American war in Syria did not just inflict material damage, it took lives of innocents. Secret strike cells dropped bombs on civilians and they tried to hide that fact. Who will investigate these deaths? The US has not been honest about its war in Syria. The wide disparity in casualty numbers also confirms that. Officially, the US-led coalition admits to a little over 1,400 civilian deaths during the Syria campaign, 1,400. Independent monitors give a much bigger number. They believe that there were anywhere between 8 to 13,000 civilian deaths. So the question now is America hiding its war crimes in Syria? And Syria is just one example. American War Crimes has its own Wikipedia page. Torture, extrajudicial killings, illegal detentions, they've done it all. Let me start with Iraq. Who can forget the Abu Ghraib prison? This is where America perfected their crimes. Prisoners were tortured, raped, sodomized and killed. All of this is documented. In fact, it was authorized by the US government. Their Justice Department released a memo before the Iraq war. It's called the Torture Memos. What did this document say? One, that US officials cannot be charged with war crimes. And two, that enhanced interrogation techniques can be used on prisoners. What are these enhanced techniques? Basically a clever way of saying torture. And two pictures sum up what America did in Abu Ghraib. Here's one of them. The prisoner is made to stand on a box. His head is covered and his fingers are connected to an wire. Do you know what his interrogators told him? If you fall off the box, you will be electrocuted. That's what he was told. Here's picture number 2. It's even worse. Naked prisoners have been piled on top of each other. Their heads are covered and posing behind them are US soldiers, all smiles. This was standard practice, apparently. The CIA regularly clicked naked pictures of their prisoners. The idea was to strip them of all dignity. Many prisoners died during such so-called interrogations. Many are still languishing in so-called US black sites. The people who did this are not soldiers, they're criminals. But the United States continues to protect them. Let me give you an example. In 2005, a US battalion in Iraq was hit by a roadside bomb in a place called Haditha. One soldier was killed, one soldier. The same day, this battalion marched into a neighborhood. They shot and killed 24 women and children. Do you know what the battalion's leader said? Shoot first, ask questions later. And do you know what his punishment was? 90 days in jail plus a pay cut. A pay cut. That's the punishment for taking 24 innocent lives. Here's another example. This is from 2007. A private security company was escorting a US diplomatic convoy in Baghdad. They say they were ambushed. In response, they killed 17 innocent Iraqi citizens. 4 of the employees were tried and convicted. But in December last year, Donald Trump, then president, pardoned them. So they're free men now. The fact is, America will do anything to protect its war criminals. They will find legal loopholes. They will use their diplomatic power. They will even build a military base on an isolated island to hide their crimes. I'm talking about the infamous Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp, or Gitmo for short. Since 2002, 780 people have been detained here. No charges, no trial, no lawyers. 731 prisoners have been transferred out. 39 still remain and 9 died in custody. Gitmo is a monument to America's ruthless crimes. Prisoners say they were tortured with broken glass, strangled with barbed wires, forcefully injected with drugs and repeatedly raped. Remember who's doing this. The supposed human rights champion, the self-proclaimed guardian of freedom. They did the same in Afghanistan. We know the Bagram Air Base is as the crown jewel of the US operation, but that was not always the case. Bagram also houses a detention camp. Prisoners were chained to the ceiling. They were beaten, sexually assaulted and killed. Then you have a list of illegal operations. The Kandahar massacre, 16 civilians dead, including 9 children. The Maiwan district murders, 3 civilians dead. The Kabul airstrike, 9 civilians dead. This last one happened this year. An entire family was wiped out in one strike. What's the punishment for such mistakes? Apparently nothing. The Pentagon says no US soldier will be punished. No jail, no demotion, not even pay cuts. And frankly, we should not be surprised. America's drone strikes are among the biggest war crimes in human history. The president orders, the Pentagon pushes a button, and innocent civilians are massacred halfway around the world. Let me show you the numbers. Since 9/11, the US has conducted 100,000 drone strikes. Do you know how many people have they killed? At least 22,000 civilians. The worst estimate is 48,000. Could any other country get away with these crimes? No, they would be sanctioned, at the very least dragged to court. And that's the other issue. The US is yet to join the International Criminal Court, which means the ICC, International Criminal Court, cannot prosecute US soldiers. Then who can? American courts. And we all know how that ends. Even if US courts convict a soldier, their president ends up pardoning him. He becomes a decorated war hero instead of a war criminal. Hollywood makes movies on them. Late night shows interview them. This is the reality of the United States. The American war machine is actually a war crime machine. It's about time someone called them out. US soldiers arrive in foreign lands as messengers of peace and freedom, but they leave as merchants of death and destruction. If Joe Biden wants to talk democracy and human rights, maybe start with your own military. Join the International Criminal Court. Subject your soldiers to independent probes. Until then, do not take the moral high ground, because the mass graves in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya and Iraq disagree. Let's shift to America's rivals now, Russia and China. What are they up to? There's a flurry of diplomacy happening between Moscow and Beijing. Presidents Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met virtually today. They were waving and smiling like high school buddies. But is there more to this relationship? Is it only about taking on the US, or does the China-Russia relationship have other meaningful intentions? The chemistry is certainly there. Both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping know how to put on a show. You may remember their famous ice cream date, or the time Xi Jinping called the Russian president his best friend. Well, that chemistry was on full display today. Take a look.
Dear President Xi Jinping, dear friend, I am glad to see you. I am greeting you. I am glad to have a chance to get in touch with a direct video call. This allows us to thoroughly discuss Russian-Chinese relations, full-scale partnership and strategic interaction. Dear friend, dear President Xi Jinping, next February I expect we can finally meet in person in Beijing as we have agreed. We will hold talks and then participate in the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympic Games. I am grateful for your invitation to attend this landmark event.
This equation was out. Both Russia and China agree on most foreign policy issues, on Iran, on Syria, on Venezuela, and on North Korea. Bilateral trade is also growing. It is expected to reach $200 billion by 2024. I know it sounds like a perfect relationship. The leaders love each other, the foreign policies align, and trade is growing. But you know what? No relationship is perfect. Both Russia and China want more. They want a military partnership. Xi Jinping pitched during the talks. He said Russia and China must jointly safeguard each other's security interests. How did Vladimir Putin respond? Well, last year he said such a prospect cannot be ruled out, and since then things have moved in this direction. Just look at the timeline. In August, Russia and China held joint military drills. For the first time, Russian soldiers trained soil. October, 10 Russian and Chinese warships sailed through the Sea of Japan. Again, unprecedented. November, 4 Chinese and Russian bombers flew over the East China Sea. South Korea ended up scrambling jets in response. In the same month, China and Russia also signed a roadmap for military cooperation. It runs from 2021 to 2025. So the trajectory is clear. Russian and Chinese militaries are joining hands. We're seeing more joint drills, more joint patrols. But this is happening in the Pacific theater. What about Europe? President Putin has deployed thousands of troops near Ukraine. What has China said about that? Well, nothing so far. If Russia is wading into the Pacific, why isn't China helping out in Europe? I can think of a few reasons. Number one, Russia has a 290-year-old Pacific fleet. It's no stranger to this region, but China has no such foothold in Europe. Reason number two, Eastern Europe is on China's wish list. It is their ticket to influencing Brussels, and most of Eastern Europe is wary of Russia's build-up. So there are gaps. Nonetheless, this alliance is bad news for the West. It's basically a two-front threat. Russian troops and artillery in Eastern Europe and Chinese warships in the Pacific, two nuclear powers, two strong armies. What about the other side? Well, you have a reluctant France, a Britain consumed by domestic politics, a Europe divided over China, and the United States, led by Joe Biden. Can Joe Biden spread his military so thin? Remember, he's also negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. If that fails, this becomes a three-front threat: Europe, West Asia, and the Pacific. The fact is, Biden cannot break this new alliance, the Russia-China alliance. His sanctions will only drive them closer. So what can the West do? Perhaps play the waiting game. Beneath all of this chemistry, the Russia-China relationship is far from perfect. We are talking about two expansionist powers, two leaders with big ambitions. How long before the bickering starts? China has big plans for Central Asia, but it has always been Russia's backyard. Chinese nationalists make territorial claims in Russia's Far East. Putin will not take kindly to such assertions. You see, an alliance between equals never really works. Take NATO, for example. It works because America is far superior to the other members. It's clear who's boss. Can Russia and China forge such an alliance? They will have to make lasting commitments then, promise to defend each other, align their militaries. It depends on Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping's ego, basically, because chances are they'll both be president for life. And until then, You can expect strong bilateral exchanges. Putin is slated to visit Beijing for the Winter Olympics. Russia is selling gas to avert China's power shortage. It's a strong relationship between two powerful countries. But that power is also their kryptonite, because where there is power, there is ambition and ego. Now, another question. Have you invested in Bitcoin? If you have, then this is a story for you. If you haven't, you would still want to watch it. India, is debating new rules for cryptocurrencies. It isn't the only country, by the way, considering laws for cryptos. Around the world, central banks are mulling their options. But the Bank of England has issued a dire warning. One of its governors believes bitcoins could become worthless and investors should be prepared to lose their money. So should you be worried? Our next report has the answer.
Crypto is the raging fad in finance these days. Anyone who wants to invest in digital currencies wants to buy this one, Bitcoin. It is an exclusive club of sorts. Only 21 million of them are up for grabs. 19 million is in circulation. One Bitcoin is worth well over $45,000. Bitcoin's total market value stands at more than $1 trillion. What if all these Bitcoins become suddenly worthless? Many would doubt if that's even possible now, but they should pay heed to this warning. It comes from the Bank of England, the central bank of the United Kingdom. Its Deputy Governor, Sir John Cunliffe, says that Bitcoin can drop to zero since it's a volatile currency. And investors should be prepared to lose everything. The Bank of England has a legitimate concern. It questions if Bitcoins have any inherent value or not. Those concerns exist for most cryptocurrencies. None of them have any intrinsic value. They are not backed by any underlying asset, but cryptocurrencies are too big to ignore as of now. Crypto assets across the world are now worth $2.6 trillion. They represent about 1% of global financial assets. More than 100 million people across the world use cryptocurrencies, and these numbers are only growing by the day. That's why central bankers are paying more attention to cryptos. The Bank of England has been lobbying for more regulation. It believes it cannot leave millions of investors unprotected. American banking regulators have announced their own plans. They plan to bring in a new policy next year. If implemented, American banks will have to seek permission before offering digital currency products. Europe has its own plans to regulate crypto. Can countries work together with different rule books on crypto? That's the next challenge. Cryptocurrencies are decentralized. They are not issued by a central bank. They are not controlled by a single entity. Last month, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi highlighted the need for a global rule book.
Cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, for example, it is important that all democratic nations work together on this and ensure it does not end up in wrong hands, which can spoil our youth.
India is drafting its own rules for cryptocurrencies. Considering the global debate, India too needs to figure out what cryptos are actually worth. It is believed 15 to 20 million crypto users are from India. Their investments could be worth $10 billion. Such large investments cannot go unregulated. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Now to the challenge that is emerging in West Asia. Arab nations that have been traditional US allies are rethinking their relationship with Washington, D.C. The United Arab Emirates is the latest. It wants the US to stop acting like Big Brother. It doesn't want to be told what to do. So why is the UAE upset? We'll get to that in a bit. First, let's tell you what the UAE has done. It has threatened to cancel an F-35 deal, a $23 billion deal with the United States, a deal to buy state-of-the-art fighter jets, drones and other defense equipment. The UAE has put that deal on hold for the moment. It was struck in August 2020. It was a cornerstone of the Abraham Accords, a gift of sorts, you could say, from Donald Trump to Crown Prince Al Nahyan, a gift for the normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE. So this deal was signed in August last year, but it hasn't really taken off. That's because American politicians have way too many conditions. They're spelling out one caveat after another. What sort of caveats? Mostly statutory requirements and guidelines on how these fighter jets should be protected. But these guidelines betray America's suspicions, and they stem from China's influence in the UAE. So what does the US fear? They fear that these fifth-generation fighter jets could become victims of Chinese espionage. So the US has laid out several conditions on how to protect them, several terms for the agreement to go ahead. The UAE feels that these terms and conditions are a bit too burdensome and inconvenient. It feels that they undermine its sovereignty and may jeopardize its ties with other countries, especially countries like China. So the UAE has warned the United States about a potential cancellation. And the timing of this warning is extremely significant. It comes on the same day when a delegation of high-ranking military officials from the UAE was visiting the US Department of Defense, the Pentagon. So it's being said that the UAE is basically trying to use the F-35 deal as a bargaining chip to win over some concessions from the United States. That this deal is being used as a ploy to make the US come to the negotiating table with more lenient conditions. Well, is that really the case? We don't know. What we can tell you, though, is how America's conditions have upset the UAE. First, the US made the UAE halt work on a Chinese facility, a facility which the Americans thought would be used for military purposes. We're talking about a Chinese shipping port being built at a secret location near Abu Dhabi. On the face of it, this facility was purely commercial, but the US said that it had intelligence that China would use it as a military base. So they put pressure on the Emiratis, and the UAE had to stop work at the site, or had work stopped. Another thorny issue is Huawei's 5G trials in the Emirati Kingdom. In 2019, the UAE allowed Huawei to install its equipment to establish a high-speed wireless network. The intention, they said, was to diversify their economy to move away from oil export-generated revenue. But Washington did not see it like that. It saw the deal as a threat to America's interests in West Asia. The US felt that Huawei would be able to steal the technology America is selling in West Asia. So it asked the UAE to pull the plug on the deal. The UAE refused. America set more conditions on the F-35 deal. The issue remains unresolved. The third bone of contention is the UAE's decision to buy Rafale fighter jets. Earlier this month, France agreed to sell 80 Rafale fighter jets to the UAE. This is part of a $19 billion deal between the two countries, France and the UAE. Now, America saw this deal as an insult, as a betrayal of its friendship. But the UAE was only trying to send a message that it has other options should Washington continue to impose stricter conditions for the F-35 procurement. Now, today, this message has turned into a warning. America has been asked to get a grip on itself, understand that it cannot dictate terms all the time. A diplomatic advisor to the UAE government has explained the reason behind the warning. He says the UAE does not want to slip into a Cold War. A tussle between China, which is one of the UAE's key economic partners, and the United States, which is one of its biggest military allies. Let me tell you what the advisor said, and I'm quoting, "There is a thin line between competition and a new Cold War. The Emirates do not want the rivalry to slide into a second Cold War. As a small state, we will be affected negatively by this and will not have the ability in any way to affect this competition even positively." Now, here's the thing. The UAE has a fair point. It shouldn't be dragged into the US-China rivalry. It's a multipolar world. Every country has the right to choose who it does business with. It cannot and should not be told what to do. At the same time, countries also need to distinguish between partners and predators, between all-weather allies and transactional players. China is known to keep friends with benefits. It has a record of laying debt traps and undermining national security of almost all of its partners. We do hope the UAE is aware about this and is making its decisions wisely. Now, From differences, let's talk about breakthroughs. The pandemic has been difficult for all of us. There have been only a few days worthy of celebration, you could say, in this year. Today is one such day. Humanity has managed to reach the sun, you could say. For the first time in human history, a spacecraft has made contact with the sun's upper atmosphere. NASA's Parker Solar Probe flew into the sun's atmosphere. It not only managed to survive the heat, the probe has also unlocked many secrets about the heart of our solar system. Our next report tells you more.
Liftoff of the mighty Delta IV Heavy rocket.
In August 2018 in Cape Canaveral, Florida, NASA launched Parker Solar Probe to touch the sun. After spending a few years spiraling closer to our star, the spacecraft has finally arrived.
It's amazing. This is a dream come true. One of the major goals for the Parker Solar Probe mission is to fly through the solar corona, and we are doing that now.
So what does it mean to touch the sun? After that, we need to look at the sun's structure. Unlike Earth, the sun doesn't have a solid surface. It's a giant ball of hot plasma that's held together by its own gravity.
The boundary that marks the edge of the sun's atmosphere is known as the Alfvén critical surface.
We didn't know exactly where this boundary was, but for the first time in history, a spacecraft has crossed it. Parker Solar Probe ventured into the corona, touching solar material still bound to the sun. For centuries, we've been studying the sun's atmosphere during eclipses because it's important for understanding how our star influences life in the solar system. But much about the corona remains a mystery.
Two of the most challenging scientific mysteries in astrophysics occur in a region that we call solar corona.
The first mystery is about the temperature. The corona is about 300 times hotter than the photosphere, the visible surface of the sun below. Secondly, there's a constant stream of particles flowing from the sun known as the solar wind. It accelerates up to millions of miles per hour out of the corona, and we don't know how. Solar wind can disrupt our satellites and technology. To better protect them, we need to go where the solar wind starts, in the corona. So heading there has been a key goal of NASA's for a while. We first proposed the idea of sending a spacecraft to the sun in 1958. We didn't have the technology to withstand the journey until the 2000s. Since its launch in 2018, Parker has been heading towards our star. Then, in April 2021, during Parker's 8th orbit around the sun, the spacecraft was around 20 solar radii, or 8 million miles from the sun's surface, when it crossed into the corona. As Parker entered, its whisper instrument took these images. Streams of plasma surrounded the spacecraft, and Parker's other instruments detected that the magnetic conditions had changed. Outside the corona, solar wind gushes out, pushing solar material away
at high speeds so that it can't return back to the sun's surface.
Inside the corona, the sun's magnetic field becomes much stronger. Solar material is slower and tethered to the sun. Instead of a smooth divide, Parker found that the boundary between these two sides is wrinkly. These bumpy ridges are created from huge flows of plasma traveling out of the corona. Scientists are not sure why this happens, but as Parker gets closer, we're finding more clues. In 2021, the spacecraft finally tracked switchbacks to one of their origins. As Parker got even closer to the sun, it detected bursts of switchbacks. Scientists traced these bursts all the way to the visible surface of the sun.
Here we see distinct cells. As heat rises beneath, these convection cells churn and create funnels of magnetic energy above the surface.
Scientists found that switchbacks inside these funnels before rising into the corona and beyond. This is only one piece of the switchbacks puzzle though. Exactly how they form is still unknown. Over the next few years, Parker will keep looking for clues as it explores our sun, the only star we can study up close. The sun is also the only star known to support life, so understanding it is critical as we search for life beyond our solar system.
That will link directly into the question, are we alone in this universe? And that is one of the biggest questions for humanity to answer.
There's a popular saying in Australia, the Prime Minister is the most important office, At the second spot is the captain of the cricket team. I could say the same about India. The captain of the Indian cricket team is a super celebrity. He's asked about politics. He's seen with Bollywood stars. And on the field, he's expected to be perfect. It's a tough job, but it's also an honor, which is why when the Indian captaincy changes hands, it is never business as usual. There is drama and politics. You know where this is headed. Earlier today, Virat Kohli sat down for a press conference. It was highly anticipated. Kohli had been removed as India's one-day captain. There were reports of a rift between him and Rohit Sharma, the new captain. Virat Kohli was quizzed about all of this, and credit to him, he played ball. He answered every question in detail, like how was he sacked? How did the selectors inform him? What is his equation with Rohit Sharma? It was literally a straight bat press conference. What Virat Kohli revealed is a problematic system. His removal as captain is a technical call, which is fine. But the way it was done left much to be desired. Listen to this.
There was no prior communication with me at all since I announced the T20 captaincy decision up till the 8th of December, where, as I said, I got a call 1.5 hours before the selection meeting, and the chief selector discussed with me the test team, to which we both agreed. And before ending the call, I was told that the 5 selectors have decided that I will not be the ODI captain, to which I replied, okay, fine. And in the selection call afterwards, we chatted about it briefly, and that's what happened. There was no communication prior to that at all.
90-minute notice. That's all he got, he says. Virat Kohli has captained India in 95 one-day matches. He's won 65 of those. Surely the BCCI could have handled this better. Perhaps gotten him on the same page or have a meeting to break the news. The BCCI did none of that. And the controversies don't end here. Virat Kohli gave up his T20 captaincy. BCCI President Sourav Ganguly says the board tried to convince him to stay on. Here's what he said. The BCCI had requested Virat to not step down as a T20 skipper, but obviously he did not agree, and the selection did not feel it right to have 2 different captains for 2 white ball formats. That's what Sourav Ganguly said. Now listen to Virat Kohli's version.
जब T20 कैप्टेंसी को छोड़ने की मैंने पहले BCCI से कम्युनिकेट किया, सबसे पहले मैंने BCCI को अप्रोच किया कि मेरा ये पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है, ये डिसीजन है और इन रीजंस की वजह से मैं ये करना चाहता हूँ, तो उसको बहुत एक अच्छे तरीके से रिसीव किया गया. उसमें कोई ऑफेंस नहीं थी, उसमें कोई हेजिटेशन नहीं थी, उसमें मुझे ये नहीं कहा गया था कि आप T20 कैप्टेंसी ना छोड़िए, बल्कि उसको बहुत अच्छे से रिसीव किया गया कि बहुत एक प्रोग्रेसिव स्टेप है और सही डायरेक्शन में है.
Who do you believe? 2 all-time greats. One is still playing, the other has retired and shifted to cricket administration. Who is speaking the truth? The fact is, we shouldn't be forced to have this debate. Cricket captains change all the time, but in India, it becomes a national controversy. Why? Because of politics. Because the BCCI lacks professionalism. We've seen this before. Think back to Sourav Ganguly's own captaincy. Why was he sacked? The Indian team's coach then, Greg Chappell, had issues with Ganguly. So he complained to the Indian Cricket Board. Someone in the BCCI leaked this email. You all know what happened next. Ganguly was unceremoniously bundled out from the Indian team. The same happened with Anil Kumble, another Indian legend. Kumble was serving as India's head coach in 2017, but his players, including Virat Kohli, revolted. They complained against Kumble to the BCCI. In the end, he had to resign as coach. Do you see a pattern here? For all the billions in their bank account, the BCCI is yet to learn professionalism. And it doesn't matter who is president, a politician, an ex-cricketer, or even a Supreme Court-appointed administrator. The same problems remain. Man management is one of them. How do you handle million-dollar athletes? How do you handle their egos? How do you communicate with modern-day greats? The BCCI will have to answer these questions. Because if India wants to take cricket to the world, it cannot make such rookie mistakes at home. On that note, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching.